Good evening and welcome everyone. I am Catherine Jordan and welcome to week 14 of our conversations on community resilience in changing times. So a big welcome to Justine Huxley and Reverend Adam Bucko. Thank you both for joining us on this conversation this evening. Really lovely to have you with us.
Great to be here, thank you.
So I'm just going to read a little something just to introduce the topic this evening, and then I'll introduce our speakers a little bit more. So this week we are speaking on the topic of spiritual leadership. So to begin this week's conversation, I first wanted to offer some explanation as to what we mean by the term of spiritual leadership. One definition of leadership is the ability to motivate, inspire and lead others. There are different models of leadership, which we may talk about later in the conversation. But first, I wanted to offer some sense of the qualities and core values that are intrinsic to spiritual leadership models. In my research on this topic, I came across some examples of the values included within spiritual leadership models, and these often include respect for others' values, fair treatment of all, expressing care and concern, listening actively and responsively, showing appreciation for others' contributions, and reflective practices which include working with emotions. They also include what can be called a person's spirit. And I'm just going to read a definition offered by the International Institute for Spiritual Leadership on what a person's spirit is. A person's spirit is the vital principle or animating force traditionally believed to be the intangible, life-affirming force within all human beings. It is a state of intimate relationship with the inner self, of higher values and morals, as well as recognition of the truth of the inner nature of others. Tonight we'll be exploring why spiritual leadership is important at this time, particularly in considering community resilience and the challenges we are facing with climate and societal breakdown. What can spiritual leadership teach us about how to engage at a deeper level with these challenges, and in a way that is wholesome and nourishing at a deeper level? I'm delighted to have our two speakers with us this evening who are pioneers, in my opinion, in the work of spiritual leadership, resilience and adaptability in this critical time. I'm delighted to just have this conversation this evening with our live audience again as well, live on Facebook. So you're very welcome to engage with us and interact with us as we're talking. Please do post your comments and questions in the chat box and we'll endeavour to weave these in as we talk. So I'm now just going to say a little bit more about our speakers this evening. So first, just to introduce Reverend Adam Bucko. So Father Adam is a committed voice in the movement of renewal of Christian Contemplative Spirituality and the growing new monastic movement. He has taught engaged contemplative spirituality in Europe and in the United States, and has co-authored two books, Occupying Spirituality, A Radical Vision for a New Generation, and The New Monasticism, an Interspiritual Manifesto for Contemplative Living. He co-founded an award-winning non-profit organisation called the Reciprocity Foundation, where he spent 15 years working with homeless youth living on the streets of New York City, providing spiritual care, developing programs to end youth homelessness, and articulating a vision for spiritual mentorship in a post-religious world. He currently serves as a director of the Center for Spiritual Imagination in New York, and is a member of the community of Incarnation, a new monastic community dedicated to the democratizing the gifts of monastic spirituality and teaching contemplative spirituality in the context of hearing and responding to the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. So big welcome to you, Adam. Really lovely to have you on the call with us today. And we also have Dr. Justine Huxley. Justine is the CEO of St Ethelburga Centre for Reconciliation and Peace, based in the heart of London, and has helped shape its vision for building community resilience in times of ecological and social emergency. St Ethelburga's model of resilience is rooted in four principles: seeking opportunities in crisis, building community across differences, putting values into action, and protecting what is sacred. Justine leads the St. Ethelburga's team, who deliver a range of innovative, and I can never say that word, innovative programs, including radical resilience, refugee allies, and reconcilers together. Justine is the editor of a book called Generation Y, Spirituality and Social Change, which aims to highlight the leadership of the younger generation. She is a follower of a Sufi tradition and has been leading meditation and dream work in groups for over 15 years now. So big welcome to you, Justine. Lovely to have you with us.
Thank you, Catherine. Lovely to be here.
Great. So I'll start with a question for you, Justine, if that's all right. Just wanted to find out from you what's really inspiring you personally at this time in regards to resilience and adaptability.
Great question. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's always just such a pleasure to be given the opportunities to speak at these times, and particularly to speak with Adam, whose organisation is a partner of St. Ethelburga's, and actually Adam's book that you mentioned inspired my own book, and he also has a chapter within it. So there's lots of existing connections there, which always makes the conversation hopefully richer in some ways. So thank you.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, great question. What's inspiring me? I think I have to say that I've been recently inspired by having the privilege to spend 10 days on a riverboat and having this little glimpse into the community of people who live on rivers and canals, and seeing these incredible potential for resilience in these communities. So I was really touched by how far out of their way people would go to help someone they'd not met before. And I think if everyone did that, the world would be a very different place. And I think maybe there's several reasons for that. I think there's something about having this thing that unites you, this passion for life on the water, but also feeling like maybe mainstream reality is this sort of alternative parallel universe over there, and like these people are united by this way of life. But there was also a lot of other things. So, for example, how your relationship with your resources is very different, where you get your energy from, how much water you use, how you dispose of human waste. All of these things are much more salient when you're living on a boat in really helpful ways that were really inspired me to think about resilience in different ways. And I think also just the barriers that protect the human community from the more than human world are also a little bit thinner when you're living on a river, and that kind of not being in so much of a human bubble was also an element that I could see in the resilience of these communities. So I felt very kind of privileged to see this little world operating, and how the seeds of resilience were there in a way that was interestingly different from my own normal everyday life with feet on Mother Earth. So that's one thing, and I think that's real life inspiration, but also just to mention the world of books and stuff. I've been very appreciative of the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs' book on morality, which I've been reading recently, and he articulates this landscape of the factors that are causing human morality to be challenged or to begin to disintegrate. And he describes this landscape of misinformation, of polarization, of the breakdown of the family, of like an economic model which doesn't protect people, or that's exploitative, and just talks about how all of these factors are actually contributing towards human morality being under threat, and what it is that we need to do to be able to protect that, and to recognize what kinds of morality all cultures share in common, and how we can strengthen that. And I think that's a really important part of the picture to describe, and I see it as a parallel threat to climate change, this disintegration of human values and this landscape of untruth that we're surrounded by. So I've been very grateful to read his articulation of that landscape. And also very inspired by this series. I think you're doing a great job, and I love the topics that you've chosen. They've been really interesting. I'm still singing your theme tune in my head.
Oh, nice. Yes, my dear friend Jamie, who made our lovely little jingle for us. Thank you, Justine. Well, and I feel just because you mentioned that, actually, this project is inspired by some work that you did and some work I did with St. Ethelburgers. So I attended the Deep Adaptation Retreat through St. Ethelburgers, which really opened my eyes to the issues that we're facing. And I felt really humbled to be part of a community of people that wanted to work together to actually look at and face these challenges together. And that's what's inspired this project. So so thank you for your work as well, which has inspired this. Thank you. Okay, great. So yeah, Adam, it would be lovely to hear a little bit more from you. So a question I had for you is, I was just curious about how your work has adapted in the last year since we've been in lockdown and in the pandemic, and what, if anything, has shifted for you in terms of focus and importance.
Thank you. It's such a joy to be here. And it's so nice to share this space with Justine. I've been a big fan of the work that is being done at St. Ethelburga in London. And whenever I get a chance to spend some time there, I always feel like that is my second home, away from home. So I'm really grateful for that space and for your leadership, Justine. Speaking of spiritual leadership, in terms of my own work, I think that when we were faced with COVID crisis here in New York City, which literally within a couple of weeks, after the first person was diagnosed, we discovered that it's a real crisis. With ice trucks parked outside of hospitals with dead bodies and etc. What I've noticed in terms of this space of spirituality and action is that lots of people, especially on social media, started to go into this kind of frantic space of offering things, offering workshops. Clergy and priests were doing masses, from their kitchen table. Like every day there was stuff going on everywhere, and I would occasionally go on Facebook and see that pretty much anyone who's a meditation teacher or who's a clergy person, they were all trying to just do stuff. And in our work at the Center of Spiritual Imagination, we began to sense that our job was to actually stop and listen. A few months before the COVID crisis, we had a visit from a clergy person who, during the attacks of September 11 in 2001, who was a priest there, just a walking distance from where everything happened. And he said something to us that was really profound. He said that when those attacks happened, he was reminded by a first responder that clergy were not really first responders, that their job was to step aside and allow all the first responders to go in to rescue people. And that then once that phase of the operation was completed, that's when clergy were needed, showing up with their spiritual resources, showing up with something to offer. And so when COVID happened in New York City, we realized that we were not first responders and that our job was to stop and listen. That yes, we could do all kinds of things to convince ourselves that what we have to offer gives us some kind of relevance, but that would actually be a mistake. And so we stopped and listened, and we just sat there for the first few days. And slowly something emerged that guided us into this awareness of how to show up. And in our case, our cathedral and the Center for Spiritual Imagination, we realized that a lot of first responders, especially doctors and nurses, were working overtime. Because of COVID, all the cafeterias in the hospitals shut down. And so all of those people were working overtime without food. And so what we did, we started fundraising. My colleague, Reverend Michael Sniffen, who was a big time Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Sandy organizer, who's now a dean of the cathedral where I served and where our center is located, had this idea that there are all these country clubs, and golf clubs and yacht clubs, because we are on an island, and some parts of this island are actually quite prosperous. So there are all these clubs that have cooks and personnel. They're living there on campus. And those people were not getting paid because they were not serving anyone. And so we fundraised and were able to make deals with some of those clubs. So people who were essentially in isolation could begin to work together with the people that they lived. So there was no danger in that. We were able to pay them, and they were beginning to cook meals that we then were able to serve to first responders in hospitals, especially hospitals that were serving some of the underprivileged people in our midst. So that was really the beginning for us, figuring out how to show up in this new reality, to show up from this contemplative heart, this heart that listens to the voice of God, this heart that is directed by what that voice says to us, versus just kind of being frantic, running around and trying to convince ourselves that we are relevant, that we have something to offer. And that grew in many different ways. Eventually, we served first responders, and then within weeks, we were on the streets of some of the inner cities, serving people who lost their jobs, especially undocumented immigrants, especially people who were homeless. I remember taking food every week to this one community in Brooklyn, where during the peak of the COVID pandemic, this priest who was originally from Mexico, and who was serving undocumented immigrants, he said on any given week, about 30 people in his community would die, mostly at home, people who were afraid to go to the hospital because of, the presidency of Trump, because they were afraid that someone would ask them whether what was their status here, and so we continue to listen today. And I think for us today, it seems that the most important thing is to initiate people into prayer, to initiate people into listening, so they can discover how they are being called to show up in these times, in these circumstances.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that, Adam. I'm so profoundly affected by that. And there's two things that really stand out for me in what you said. Is one, that natural movement in human beings to adapt and respond that we've seen during the pandemic, that you talked about at the beginning of that, which I've definitely seen in my community as well, that it really is in us, in moments of crisis, there is that natural, innate human response to adapt and respond. And it's really come to the surface. I think that's been a real gift of this time. And I love also that you and your community have held that deep space for listening in this time, rather than getting caught in the sort of franticness of it, that you've taken that opportunity to rest back and to listen. Yeah, it's lovely to hear that, really lovely to hear that. Thank you. So Justine, I'll move on to another question for you, if that's okay. So I'm aware, when we talked about what St Ethelburga's is doing recently, I'm aware that one of the programs that's been running at St Ethelburga's recently is called Radical Resilience. Given what I'm doing, I'm slightly curious about radical resilience. I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. So this series is part of a bigger piece of work which has been evolving over the last 3 or 4 years at St Ethelburga's, and it was partly inspired originally by the IPCC report in 2018 and Jem Bendel's paper on deep adaptation, which I'm sure you remember. And what we felt at the time was that Jem's piece of work in particular didn't necessarily tell us things that we didn't already know, but what it did do is give us permission to talk about ecological and social collapse, and to not shy away from that conversation, which I think was, a reality inside many people's hearts and imaginations, but somehow his work gave us permission to look at it. So originally this series came out of working with deep adaptation, and in those days the retreats and the processes that we led had this quality of an initiatory journey, that we were going into that landscape and saying, what if these worst case scenarios will actually unfold, and what does it mean to face that reality with courage? And so that's evolved into a piece of work that recognizes that we still need to do everything we can to mitigate climate breakdown, but there is also this need for this parallel piece of work that is about preparing and adapting for climate breakdown, which is about building resilience. And Catherine, you know all about that. So our model of resilience, as you said in the introduction, includes these 4 different elements, and really the 2 core pieces of it from my perspective are that we see resilient communities as communities that live in relationship with Earth, and secondly that can navigate difference, and communities that stretch across divides and differences. And I think this this second piece, 2 things: it's reflecting that actually our safety and our security is in each other. It's not in stocking up our bunkers and doing this solo prepping. It's actually our safety lies in each other. And it's also pointing towards the need that if we genuinely build community across differences, we have to be able to look at the historical harms that are present within our history and the systems of oppression that have created those harms, and have the courage to actually work with those, which isn't always easy. So these 2 core elements and how they come together, the relationship between colonization and the destruction of Earth, those elements are present in everything that we do. But the model also has these different facets, and my colleague Claire Martin has recently developed the model to include these elements of truth, how we speak the unspeakable truths of our time, and how we navigate this landscape of untruth that's around us, and vision, how we hold a longer term vision, and that's something I can say a little bit more about later. And also the need for courage. And I personally, I feel that we're going to need courage by the bucket load in the future, and we need it now in the way things are unfolding. So our way of working with resilience is primarily values based. We're working at an individual level and at a community and organizational level. And values is really fundamental. I think if I imagine walking into a future of climate and social collapse, it's terrifying. But if I imagine walking into that future with my most deeply held values alive in my heart, for example, to be of service to others, then that terrifying landscape becomes a testing ground for the spirit, and becomes something actually to be met with joy. So I think digging really deep into our values is a tremendous source of resilience that really changes the way we experience that reality. And I was very affected a few years ago by a blog that I read, and I can't unfortunately remember or relocate this blog, so I can't name the author of it, but it was a young woman in a South American country that was already in the midst of ecological and social collapse. And she was saying that her advice to the rest of the world was really, think about your values, work out what your values are, write them down, stick them on your fridge, and actually live by them, because once collapse starts happening in its fullness, those values will be eroded. And I thought that was an incredibly salutary warning that I think is really important to take on board. So I think, there is this threat to our values through the things that are unfolding on a planetary level, but also living our values is a tremendous source of resilience. So we're working primarily with this values-based model, but also looking at action. And we had a little snippet of conversation earlier, Catherine, about the need to take the learning of resilience into making practical changes in communities. So we try to do that. We try to work with every cohort to support them to actually take what they learn into their own communities and build that resilience. And I think it's, I've been interested to see how COVID has generated that. And I think, Adam, your response to that previous question was so moving, just this business of waiting and allowing something to unfold in an organic way. And I think there's been so much of that going on, which is so inspiring, but we really also need to properly understand what resilience is and give everybody everywhere the capacity to tune in and build that.
Thank you, Justine. It's really lovely to hear about that project. It makes me quite excited to hear that, to hear about these things that are going on. And this, is there another program of this running at St. Ethelburga's? Is there going to be more of this?
Definitely, there's more. Yeah, watch this space.
Great. So anywhere where you're watching or listening to this conversation, there will be a link for St. Ethelburga's if you're interested in what they're doing. Because I think is there an online program?
We're working on one at the moment. It's not actually on the website at the moment, but it's coming.
Okay, it's coming soon. Okay, so definitely watch this space. Great. I really, really great to hear about that. And I also appreciate this this courage that St. Ethelburga's team have to really take the lead on this, because I think many people, including part of myself, are kind of fumbling in the dark in many ways, and it's so important to have people like you there ready to kind of help and guide so many of us. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so Adam, I'll move on to another question for you. So my sense of your work from a distance is that you're reviving and modernising the jewels from the Christian faith to really meet the needs of the time that we're in. I wonder if you could tell us how you perceive this and what really motivates you in that work. I'm really curious what's personally behind that for you and what motivates you in it.
Thank you for your question. I remember many years ago, I was sitting in an office with my spiritual director, who was this old Jesuit priest, a very wise priest, who was also very disorganized and kind of a bit of a wild character. And we sat and we talked, and the meeting was taking place at a huge Jesuit university. And I don't remember what we were talking about, but he said something like, "Look at all this." And then he said, "When I went to seminary, there were almost 200 of us in our group. Some of them quit, but many of those guys were ordained and now are serving. Now the same seminary has 15 people. Probably 10 of them will make it." And then he said, we have this amazing tradition, all of these gifts about how to discern the will of God in our lives, about how to get to know our desires and see through that, discover God's desire for our lives. We have all these tools about listening and responding and being sent into the midst of the suffering world to be this kind of a transfiguring and reconciling power. But he said all of that soon will not be available to the younger generation unless we figure out how to translate our gifts into something that could still speak, that could give meaning, that could inspire, that could support. And so for me, in my life, I've been blessed with quite a few really wonderful mentors. And even though I'm a Christian priest, and my ministry as one of, as during the ordination, you're told that whatever you have done before, you might have done it in your own name. Now you do everything in Christ's name. And so I take that very seriously, that, my vocation here on this earth is to essentially let Christ live through me as much as possible. Let Christ live and love and sometimes protest through me as much as possible. But I've been blessed with all these mentors, and, I had a mentor who was a kind of this wild Hasidic rabbi who spent years rescuing kids from sex work and prostitution on the streets of New York City. I have had Sufi mentors, I have had Hindu mentors, and I have had some really wonderful Christian mentors, Christian hermits and Christian monastics. And what I've discovered in those relationships is that none of them were really trying to pass on their tradition to me. What they were interested in was to become this kind of a very special presence in my life, where they could relate to me deeply, where they could share about their own struggles and their own experiences of how they experienced God in their lives, of how they found and lost and then again found God in their lives. And I think what happened in my life is that all of those stories, all of those ways of being present to me became this kind of a mirror in which I was beginning to see what my life needs to be. Through learning how God was present in their lives, I've learned skill sets to be able to recognize how God was present in my own life. And then they gave me this dangerous permission to say yes to that something that was emerging in me, that something that was of God. And so early on in my work with young people, especially those people who lived on the streets in New York City, I discovered this kind of a way of working with young people that was really, that located me outside of the religious system, so to speak. I was grounded in this awareness of Christ. And, my spiritual practices have always been quite traditional, actually. I grew up in Poland, it's a very Catholic country. A lot of that is still present in me. I pray the rosary. How cool is that? Well, not so cool to many people, but I've been formed by that. But I discovered this kind of a way of being present to the young generation, the way my mentors were present to me. And through that process, I discovered that young people were really waking up to a new kind of spirituality. And that was really what my book, Occupy Spirituality, that I co-wrote with Matthew Sachs, was about. Naming all of those new ways in which young people are living their spirituality. But what I've also discovered in that process is that there are some things that have not yet been developed in that new space, and that those things can only be developed when the religious traditions rediscover their gifts, reclaim their gifts, and then start showing up in that post-religious space in a way that my mentors showed up for me. And so in that sense, I think it's important that all of our religious traditions go back to our roots and rediscover what our way is, what our gifts are, and then bring them back to the world in a way that can serve the future, in a way that can help people to rediscover who they are in God, help people to rediscover how they are related to this beautiful earth that we are on, right? And so for me, I think my vocation is twofold. On one hand, it is to rediscover what my tradition is, re-articulate how it can show up in the 21st century. And then the second part of my vocation is to then pass that tradition on to the people who feel called to enter the Christian tradition and make a serious commitment to it. And then the second part of that is to show up for people who are spiritual but not religious, or post-religious, or interspiritual, and offer all the gifts that we have in our tradition without asking anything back in return. Because that's the Christian path. The Christian path is not about self-preservation. It is about complete spending. So that's what we should be doing. We should be spending everything that we have, our money, our buildings, but also the gifts of our tradition, realizing that young people might actually be called to do something different with what we have. But all of that needs to happen in this kind of a deep mutual dialogical conversation, because young people need the wisdom of the traditions, and the traditions need the wisdom of young people. And, you know when I was younger, I was pretty arrogant, thinking that I know more than I actually did. So I think it's important that we cultivate these relationships and that we learn how to travel together and how to discern together.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much, Adam. I wonder if I could just ask you a bit of a spontaneous question off the back of what you've said. Just wonder if you could capture what you're seeing with young people in terms of their experience of spirituality. What's the themes that you're really seeing with young people?
I mean, I think that I've been seeing this for the last decade and a half. I think that some younger people are interested in talking about spirituality, some are not. But one question that is very important, almost universally, is, as I look at this world that is breaking, what the heck am I going to do with my life? How am I going to respond? How am I going to show up in a way that can give me joy, but also in a way that can allow me to hold someone who is suffering, to respond to the earth that is hurting? And so I think for me, in this kind of new post-religious spirituality, but it's the same is true for Christian spirituality, is this question of vocation, this question of calling, because that's what I see in young people, that young people are struggling with this question about, who am I called to be? And for me, that's a religious question, because in a Christian language, that question, this is what it sounds like. What kind of icon of Christ am I called to be? How am I to allow God to live through me, to occupy this vehicle of my body and mind and soul, and enter it, touch all of my woundedness and transfigure it into something that could become my unique gift to the world? And so that's what I'm seeing, so I think it's important to guide people into that experience of getting a sense of that impulse of God that wants to just grab them and take them into the world and show them what their gift is. And that's a real experience of God. And you can't have that experience unless you become a contemplative. And what I mean by contemplative is unless you learn how to be in this state of receptivity and listening, when you can begin to sense that something moving in you. And of course, once you begin to sense that, first of all, you can't sense that really without proper spiritual guidance. And you can't really say yes to it without proper spiritual community that can help you to build courage to say yes to that. Because if you say yes to that, that calling, that impulse will most likely put you in conflict with your friends, with the institutions that you participate in, with our dominant society, which is about, consuming and building and hoarding and etc. So once you have that experience, I think once a young person has that experience, then it's in a way easy to introduce them to spiritual practices, because we no longer are talking about some kind of an abstract God and some kind of esoteric practices that maybe they don't relate to well. We're talking about an experience that they just had. We just need to name it for them properly, help them to name that properly. And then the practices and the spiritual narratives become ways of them reconnecting with that experience that they had and deepening that experience and saying yes to that experience, so they may become an instrument of that energy in the world.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad that these young people have you to guide them in that way. I also work with young people and really resonate with a lot of what you said at the beginning of that. The lack of meaning being a big thing for young people at the moment. So thank you very much for speaking to that. I'm really grateful. So I'll go on to some more generic questions, and Justine, maybe I can pose this first one to you. So it just links on from what Adam said there actually about contemplative practice and how that links to spiritual leadership. I just wonder if you have something you could offer to that. What is the connection between those two, and is it important to have contemplative practice to engage with spiritual leadership?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think I'd have to describe what I see as spiritual leadership before going into that question. So I think it's really important to say that spiritual leadership can show up in any discipline or any industry or any sphere of life. And I think, Adam is coming from an environment where, faith is present, and, that's the thing that's there. But spiritual leadership can come anywhere. And I think there's many different ways of describing it, but I think I would see it as being primarily anything that seeks to solve the crisis that we're in currently through going to the root of that crisis. And my understanding of the root of this crisis would be the separation of spirit and matter. And that, our worldview has given us an understanding of the universe where spirit is somewhere else, and what we're left with here on earth is this dead matter, which is, available for exploitation. And that spiritual leadership at this time is anything that seeks to actually unite spirit and matter. And that can be done, I guess, through lots of different ways, through not just through spirituality or activism, but through science and through economics. And there are, many ways those things can be united. So I would see that as being fundamental. And also, I think something about being in service to something that's greater than oneself. And whether you use a religious language for that, you're talking about God, or you're talking about earth and the wider web of life, or whether you're talking about the collective intelligence that is present within and behind all things, but to be aspiring to go beyond one's own desires, one's own ego, one's own priorities and needs to serve something bigger. I think that's an essential element of what spiritual leadership is. And also maybe to be coming from this deeper place where we're not in some way, we're separating ourselves. So there's this plugging into this thing that's greater than yourself, but there's also a detaching from the aspect of collective thinking, which is groupthink, which is consensus conditioned reality. So we're plugging into this bigger thing, but we're also separating ourselves from this conditioned reality. So understanding that as spiritual leadership, then one obviously needs practices that can help one remove the barriers that prevent you from serving that greater thing. And one also needs practices that can take you into that consciousness, or into the place where that split between spirit and matter are healed, both in terms of one's consciousness, but also in terms of the practical action that emerges from that. So I think there are many practices that can do that for people, but actually putting yourself into relationship with that greater thing and putting yourself into a place where that split is healed and taking oneself out of this conditioned reality. And that can be done through all sorts of different, you know, all the plethora of spiritual practices that exist around the world. So yeah, contemplative practices are needed for that, but I would also say that embodied practices are really important, because, you know, anything that makes us think that spirituality has to be conducted in a cave rather than actually including the body. So embodied practices feel really important. And there's also this aspect of integrating our own shadows, and, you know, this process of projection is a dualism. You're creating dualities in your mind. So we can't actually heal the split in the world and heal the root of this crisis if we're actually recreating that split inside ourselves. So working with our own shadow and integrating that, I kind of see that as like rewilding the psyche. I mean, it's like we can't, you know, rewild the world unless that's also reflected inside us. And so that kind of experience of the wholeness of life is present within those contemplative practices. So, and I'm sure Adam would have a huge amount to say about that kind of thing. But I also think, just, you know, one more thing on how I see spiritual leadership. I just was very inspired by this quote from Parker Palmer, who said, let's talk about inner life and social change. If you look at the great movements that have transformed the face of the world, those for women's emancipation, for example, or Black liberation, what you find is that these movements were started by people who have had every form of external power stripped from them. So they've had no status in the eyes of the law or larger society, no credibility, they have no political leverage and no money. And this is where we normally locate power in the external world. So he was saying, where do these people get the power to start these movements? The answer is in the only place where nobody can take it from you. And that's the human heart, the spirit, and the inner life. And I think that's a really important message for our times, because, you know, as we walk into this very uncertain future, many things that we consider to be sources of power will be stripped from us, as they have done in the pandemic. We've lost all kinds of freedoms in this space. So spiritual leadership for me is about how we actually respond, you know, from that deeper place of our own inner spirit, where we have the freedom and the choice to meet those unfolding realities from a different place inside ourselves. Yeah, so I think that hopefully answers your question.
It does, thank you. And I'm just wondering, I really love the description of the separation of matter and spirit in whatever way we might understand that, how that's really crucial, and talking about, you know, contemplative practice, embodiment, those kind of things being really helpful. If someone was interested in engaging with that in themselves, what might be a kind of first step that they could take towards that?
Oh, really good question. Well, I like the book 10 Spiritual Practices by Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, who, as you know, is my teacher. And these are, you know, really simple embodied practices that bring us into relationship with the sacred dimension of life. Really simple things that could include, you know, gardening or cooking with love or cleaning. And I think these practices are a really wonderful way of uniting that split. But what I've found is, you know, through the work that we've done around spiritual ecology, is that there are millions of spiritual ecology practices, and like everyone has their own way of uniting those two things. So I wouldn't want to be prescriptive, but rather to say people can find their own ways of bringing those things together in an infinitely more creative way than, you know, that's right for them.
Yeah, thank you. But you've named a few suggestions, like cooking food with love. You know, that's a really simple one, isn't it? So yeah, thank you. Adam, would you like to add anything to this in terms of your interpretation of what is spiritual leadership?
You know, I think that Justine's answer was just so beautiful. I'm really grateful for your articulation, Justine, and I can't really think to think about anything to add to that. I think maybe I just wanted to mention that right now. I am reading this new book that just came out. It's called Desmond Tutu, A Spiritual Biography of South Africa's Confessor, by Reverend Michael Battle, who was a chaplain of the Archbishop. And I'm really moved by that, you know, because here's someone who was, I mean, super active in the movement against apartheid, someone who was, I mean, just very engaged in life, someone who also had a family, and yet someone who managed to spend a few hours a day doing spiritual practice every morning. And, you know, there would be a lot of pressure when he would travel and people wanted to arrange his schedule so he could give, you know, 5 talks and not 2 talks a day. And the people who handled Desmond Tutu's schedule would say, well, if you like the Tutu you see, then you have to respect the life that he is living. And that means that he's not going to be able to do everything that you want to ask him to do, because he needs to show up from that deep place. And so here's someone who I think really lived what spiritual leadership meant in his context. And I really love Justine's emphasis on the relationship, on those 10 spiritual practices. I love how simple and yet profound, and how engaged in life those practices are, like cooking with love, you know. I think for myself, the older I get, the more I discover how important it is for me to have a physical spiritual practice, and also a practice that connects me to the earth. Just really allowing myself to be getting loved up by the earth, you know, standing barefoot, breathing in, and just being held by that energy. So that's really the only thing that I want to add, which is more of a personal take on what Justine so beautifully described.
Would you mind sharing with us what your practices are, how you get into that experience of being loved up with the earth?
So, you know, my practices in terms of my daily practices are fairly traditional. So I pray the divine office every day, in the morning and at night. And those are the traditional prayers that people in the Christian tradition have said, especially in monasteries, almost for 2,000 years. And I don't always love those prayers, but, you know, I don't always love all the Psalms, for example, and some of the content. But I'm reminded by the ancient church fathers and mothers that when we pray those words that people have been using for prayer for a very long time, when we can get to the point when those words are not somebody else's words but my words, I'm discovering that those prayers give me the language to name my inner realities and my inner conflicts and bring them to God. And also some of that language, and especially the stuff from the scripture, also creates a container that begins to give me direction and begins to help me to discern how to take the next step, right, in my life. So there's that practice. Then I have a practice of silence for about an hour a day, of just sitting in receptive silence and bringing all of my life to God and consenting to God's love and action in me, inviting it in, and then basically letting God do the work of healing on me. So whatever I have can be used for the world in my service. I also have the practice of repeating the holy name, where I walk around, where I don't have to be super focused on something, just the simple repetition of the holy name that really gives me the sense of being enveloped in God's presence, of being protected by God's presence, of being guided towards where I need to be and how I need to be. And then I also have a practice of walking meditation, of just walking around my neighborhood or wherever I need to be, and walking as if my feet were kissing the ground, so to speak. And I use a little, slokas or mantras or gathas with it. So I breathe in and I say, God is here. I breathe out, I say, thank you. I breathe in, I say, the earth, the flowers, the sky are here. I breathe out, I say, thank you. I breathe in and I say, my life with all of this, my life with God is here. And I breathe out, I say, thank you. I breathe in, I say, peace is here. And I breathe out and I say, thank you. And this is my kind of informative practice of constantly putting myself in relationship with God, with the sacred earth, with my circumstances, trying to see all of that with new eyes, trying to see how all of this reality is soaked in God's love and God's energy and God's light. And then, I have other practices like taking an extended retreat each year, being in psychotherapy every week to work on my shadow, engaging with my body through hiking and through daily exercise, being in spiritual direction, being part of a community where I get to confess all of my shortcomings and ask for forgiveness, and where I get to hear how, hopefully in a loving way, how, sometimes I have a tendency to get off my track. So those are kind of the practices that are part of my life.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for sharing those. I feel like Justine and I were kind of going along in that with you. I could see that. It was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very much. One of the things that I do is I swim in the sea. I live right on the beach. I'm very lucky to live on the beach, and I swim in the sea most mornings. And I have a little ritual. I talk to the sea. I call her my mama, so I call her mama. Hi, mama, and I talk to her as if she's my mama. And I go in the morning and I offer her some rose petals normally, and I offer them, and then I wait for her to come and meet my feet, and it's such a beautiful feel. I just wanted to share it because just as I was listening to you, I thought, I just thought I'd share my experience of how I meet her every morning. And there is always this moment where she comes to me and she brings me in. And more and more at the moment, I'm overcome by the unconditional love in the natural world and how much she loves us all the time. It's just, yeah, I think I'll move on because it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming, but she's loving us all the time in so many ways. So thank you for sharing your practices. Okay, I wanted to pick up with you as well, Adam, about the contemplative practice. There's something that's in my mind that keeps coming back to me, so I'm going to dare to do it. I'm going to dare to say it. I heard about something that you did with a spiritual ecology group when you came and did some work here in England, where you engaged people into kind of more active prayer. And I only heard it secondhand, so I might not have heard it correctly, but where something around you were engaging people to get really activated and really kind of enlivened and then pray. And I heard about this secondhand, and I was so inspired by it. It really, for me, even secondhand hearing that, it really changed my relationship to prayer. And I then sort of really considered my energy when I pray. You know, am I really engaged in that prayer? Is all of me really in it? And a lot of the time it wasn't. And so that practice really helped me, even secondhand, to engage a much deeper level, a more physical, embodied prayer. Do you mind? Have I got that right? Is one question. Is that something you do, or is that? I just wonder if you could tell us about that.
It was quite a long time ago, you know, but I can share what my experience of that is in terms of my daily prayer and where it came from actually in my life. And Justine was there, so maybe she can correct me if
I remember it well.
So, you know, I think that especially in contemplative spaces, and I'm going to say this as a guy who loves silence, you know, and that's really my orientation. In so many ways, I am really a hermit at heart, you know, and I love silent prayer. But I think that contemplatives sometimes look down on people who use words or on people who can't sit still. And sometimes, not always, I think that is also part of the kind of colonial mindset where we kind of apply a very specific view of what could get us in touch with God, right? And the kind of prayer that I learned from my Hasidic rabbi mentor was very different. He said, you know, yeah, you like silence, that's great. You can do that if you like. You know? Like, what do you mean if I like? And he said, you know, when you pray, go outside, get in touch with like what every cell of your body is feeling. And then give voice to this and talk to God about it, but not just, you know, talk nicely and politely. Really talk like you mean it. Scream, cry, shout, and even imagine that all the little leaves and all the green things around you are praying with you, carrying those words up. And I started praying this way, you know, and there's a Hasidic teaching that's very beautiful. It says, you know, when you see someone praying and they are not polite and they are not, you know, very well composed, don't judge them, because a drowning person will do anything to hold on to something, to a rope. And so that's what that prayer is, a prayer of a person who maybe is drowning, you know. So what I've discovered is that for me, that's a starting point in prayer now, where I do that. And what I realized is that silence is a natural outcome, but it's not a technique. It's just where I end up. And so that's what I do. I give voice to everything that is alive in me. I scream, I shout, I talk to God. And then when I'm completely spent, where I have no more tears, where I have no more words to be said, I just surrender and I just release everything to the earth, and then just let the earth, let God hold me and love me into newness, love me into who I need to be, who God wants me to be, right? And of course, that teaching is not that different from what people like Saint Teresa of Avila advocate. She talks about talking to God. She herself was very passionate and wild, and knew how to celebrate, but also knew how to be silent. And it's kind of like in human relationships, initially when we are just getting to know someone, we talk quite a bit. And then as we progress, sometimes just gazing at our partner or our friend communicates more than any words could communicate. And then eventually we get to that point where we don't even have to talk. We can just rest in silence and be aware of each other's presence, delighting in it, feeling safe because of it. And so anyway, that's my recollection, but Justine, maybe you can.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from Justine. What was your experience?
I remember it well because I went out with Adam's instructions to this field and sat myself down in my little sit spot and started wrestling with God. And I closed my eyes, and when I sort of sat down and closed my eyes, there was a herd of sheep like on the far side of the field. Anyway, I got into it. I was having this really ferocious argument with God. I was so like I was so into it, and after about 10 minutes of like shouting really loud, I opened my eyes, and the entire field of sheep had come really close, and like the lead sheep was literally like a meter away from me, whereas they'd been on the far side before, and they were just surrounding me in the semicircle, looking really concerned. It was just like, oh, my prayers have been answered. It's a message from the sheep. So it was very memorable.
Wow.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for sharing that.
I think what the message that really sort of came home from me for that is that, it doesn't have to look conventional, does it? To be in prayer and in relationship to God and in relationship to the divine. It doesn't have to follow any fixed narratives, to find your own way. And it just, for me, it broke the mold. And I really appreciated that it breaks the mold and allows us to engage in a different way. So yeah, thank you for sharing more of that. I'm really glad you told us about it.
Thanks.
So spiritual leadership. If someone's feeling, I mean, can anyone get involved in spiritual leadership? And if so, what might that look like? Anyone feel moved to respond to that? Justine?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. I really enjoyed reflecting on this before. And I feel that a greater part of leadership, whether it's spiritual or otherwise, is leading ourselves. I think that always comes into it. And if I think about my definition of spiritual leadership being about healing this split between spirit and matter, and also being of service to something greater than oneself, it's like what it takes to be in service to something greater than oneself is a constant act of leading oneself. There's really a lot involved in that. And I think, so this morning I woke up feeling like my inner teenager was having a bit of a hissy fit, and I was feeling really grumpy. And I think there's something about the discipline of spiritual practice and just getting yourself to show up, and I can, that actually can really transform that. So I kind of feel like how we lead ourselves into relationship with that greater thing, and how we lead ourselves particularly when things are difficult, is really important, and the role of discipline in being able to do that. So I kind of feel like leading ourselves is a really important thing. And I've really struggled with leadership, and I think probably 50% of my leadership has just actually been showing up and kind of with the intention to serve. And I remember this, I don't know if you remember that poem prayer thing that was written by a Ryan Mountain Dreamer. And she talked about, it was something along the lines of, you know, I don't care where you live or how much money you've got, but what I care about is, can you get up after a night of grief and pain and do what you need to do to feed the children? And I remember finding that particular line very moving, because it speaks to this like disciplined practice of, you know, whether you're a parent or not, and of course being a parent is a tremendous act of spiritual leadership, but this disciplined practice of putting your own needs on one side and like showing up to be there for other people. So for me, that's a really important aspect, is like how we lead ourselves. And I think there's also an element that's, you know, we might think of spiritual leaders as people who can start these incredible movements of millions of people, but also maybe spiritual leadership is just about, you know, watching a sunset with love in your heart, you know, and it's this quality of, you know, how we're being rather than doing. And, you know, I think there's something about the loss that we're experiencing, and like maybe there's value in just, you know, holding a tiny little beetle in your hand, knowing that that particular species is under threat of extinction, and grieving for that, you know, that is an act of, you know, profound leadership for these times. And I was listening to Rainer Maria Rilke's poetry on Emergent magazine the other day, and he says this beautiful line, that's when he's talking about facing death, and he says, just give me more time, just give me more time so I can love the things that have never been loved, or so I can love things in a way they've never been loved before, or maybe it's love the things that other people haven't loved, something like that. And I just find that a really beautiful calling for our time. So, you know, what's more important, leading a movement of 1,000 people, or actually loving that beetle that's going to go extinct, you know? And I think there's also something about, you know, when we talk about leading ourselves and, you know, how all of us can be spiritual leaders, there's something about changing our relationship with suffering that I find really relevant for the times. And I was reading this great book by Lama Yeshe last night at 3 a.m. when I couldn't sleep. And he was talking about his childhood and his life in Tibet. He's a Tibetan master. And he described being in the monastery in Tibet, and as a teenager, as a 15-year-old, and hating it. And it was like a real suffering for him, you know, and he really reacted against that suffering and resisted it and kind of went through all of this pain. And then before he knew it, the Chinese had invaded, and they were refugees, and they were, you know, traveling through the Himalayas with the risk of being shot, with the risk of starvation, with the risk of hypothermia, of getting lost in the mountains. So suddenly that suffering that he went through was kind of meaningless in the face of what they were going through then. And he wrote really movingly about how he recognized there was this real need to change the relationship with suffering, and instead of reacting, you know, in the situation he was in, because it was so extreme, like there was no space for reaction or resentment or passivity or a mental attempt to run away. And actually he had to find within himself this quality of forbearance. And he was inspired by his the role modeling of his spiritual teachers who were with him on how to live that quality of forbearance. And I found that very moving and very relevant to spiritual leadership for our times, because I feel like where humanity is at the moment is we're that teenager in the monastery that thinks we're suffering, but you know, in the West, for example, but we don't, it hasn't even started yet. You know, there's so much more to come. And it's like, can we change our relationship with, so we have a more mature relationship with suffering, so that actually when things do get more difficult, we can be in relationship with that suffering in a different way. And that's about spiritual leadership, and it's also very much about resilience, because how we are with suffering is going to be like a really important aspect of how we do resilience. So I thought it was a really good question, Catherine, and I feel, you know, completely certain that everyone anywhere can engage in spiritual leadership.
Thank you so much for the answer. Wow, so refreshing. I love how you've just brought it down to really simple personal things, because I think quite often when we think of the word leadership, we think we have to be out there with 50 people behind us, and there has to be this grand thing, and you've brought it back to something really simple and really honest and very personal. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. Anything to add to that, Adam?
No, again, I think Justine just nailed it beautifully. Thank you for that, wonderful answer.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we've only got 10 minutes left, unfortunately. It's gone very quickly. So I think I'll move on to our last question, which feels quite important, a quite important question that I'd like to finish on. So what do you see as being the most important challenge we're facing? And what do you feel personally moved to as a resilient response to that? Open to either of you.
Do you want to speak to that, Adam, or shall I go for it?
Justine, feel free to go.
Okay. I feel one of the biggest challenges that's facing us right now is to let go of illusions. And I think there's two illusions that I would name as being really important right now. I think firstly, the illusion that everything's going to be okay. And I think it's very hard for people to break that habit and actually, face the reality of what's going on this planet with integrity. And I think it's like one can do that, one can face the science and face the situation we're in, but then before tea time, you've gone back to acting as if it's all going to be okay. And I think the business of properly facing and integrating the fact that, in consensus reality terms, it's not going to be okay, is a really important act. And that actually, if we do that on a deep enough level, it can enable us to separate out what's truly essential in this time from what's just packing and what's, what actually, because we do so many things that don't actually make sense given the landscape we're in. So letting go of the illusion that everything's going to be okay, I think is really important. And I think the other one, I mean, we're surrounded by so many illusions, but the other one that I feel moved to name is the illusion of anthropocentrism, that we're at the center of things. And I think I suppose I mean that in two different ways, because the ego wants to put itself at the center of everything permanently. And I think the ego has this tremendous gravitational pull that pulls people back into thinking that, their needs and their perspectives and what they need is the greatest thing. And then, of course, there's the element of human beings seeing themselves as, somehow superior to the rest of life on Earth. And I think that hierarchical understanding of our importance in the chain of being is also quite a difficult neural pathway to change. And I think, think particularly for Western consciousness, and I've been very inspired by Tiokasin Ghosthorse, who is a Lakota elder, and he teaches that worldview of interbeing very much through language. And what I find so fascinating is that, you can ask him to translate one Lakota word, and it will take him half an hour, because Lakota is so multidimensional and so alive with different dimensions that actually it can't be translated into Western consciousness in such an easy way. And I feel like even when working in spiritual groups, there is this subtle distortion that comes in when you try and move human beings out of that role of, supremacy above the rest of life. And that actually, I was with a group the other day, and we were inviting the group to pray for the earth. And it was remarkable how quickly that prayer actually translated in, we're actually praying for ourselves and we haven't really noticed, so there's something about how we shift out of that anthropocentric view. And, you asked the question, what do I feel moved to do in relationship with that? And I suppose I feel this is in a way my main it's not my main practice. I have lots of practices, but for me, it's a very important part of how I want to be on this earth at the moment, is through learning to be part of this great conversation with the more than human world, and the techniques and practices that can allow us to tune into that language that is, you know, many different other than human languages, but it's really just one language that we can tune into with our receptivity. And, you know, I've been so inspired by teachers like Adam Bucko, who have this profound relationship with the more than human world, and teach these ways that you can actually begin to have conversations with all of these different elements of the natural world. And I find that an immensely life-changing and rewarding way to be in the world. And actually, I think Eleanor O'Hanlon, the conservationist, was a very important mentor for me in this. And like when I first met Eleanor and began to learn these ways of being, I had this constant feeling of like that something really exciting had just happened in my life, and I couldn't remember what it was. People would say, "How was your weekend?" And I feel like the most exciting thing ever had happened, but I couldn't quite name it. And after a couple of years, I realized that's what it was. It was this way of changing our relationship so that we're part of this circle of life. And so this experience of being in communion with these many different elements of the natural world. And I find that such a immensely life-changing and rewarding experience that, you know, and it's not something I really talk about in public. It's not something I teach. It's not part of my work at St. Ethelburga's, but on a private level, you know, that's the commitment that I hold to change that anthropocentrism in myself. And it's something I feel incredibly passionate about. So yeah, that's the story.
Thank you for naming that. I mean, one of the things we're doing within this series is looking at conquest mentality, and we're doing two-part series on that, which is part of what you were talking about, this kind of inbuilt thing in the West to conquer, which is part, one part of that. And it's something that I've really been working with in myself since doing that within the series. We were kind of enlightening it in one part, and then we're going to do more of the kind of how to actually dismantle it in another part. And it's I feel like that's a really important part of what you just talked about. It's so, I feel like we need a bit of a how-to, because it's I feel like we could have a whole other conversation just on that, because it's one thing to know it, and it's another thing to know how to really dismantle it in ourselves and come into a relationship in another way. So thank you very much, Justine. Really appreciate that. Okay, Adam. Yeah. So the same question to you. So what are you? What's the kind of top card for you at the moment in terms of the challenge you're seeing, and what are you feeling drawn to as a response?
I think there are a couple of things that are maybe on some level seemingly unrelated to all the, or at least some of the difficulties that we are facing as a community, as species. I think the first one is this question about what gives us meaning, the way that we kind of understand ourselves, and what makes us alive, what gives us a sense of purpose. And you know, when I look into that, even when I observe myself, and if I'm really willing to be honest with myself, I see that for many of us, winning gives us a sense of aliveness. Winning gives us a sense of purpose. And, you know, whether we're fighting on the streets, you know, trying to fight for a better world and a sustainable future, or whether we are part of the dominating culture, there's this sense in which we are not willing to come to terms and confess our powerlessness. It's just different ways of us trying to kind of recreate a story so we can replicate this kind of a principle of domination. It's almost, you know, like observing two children fighting over a toy. That there's this sense of just fighting for relevance, fighting to win, fighting to feel like whatever we have could be applied to something that we see, in our world being a problem. And I think the longer I practice, the more I tune into my own heart and also to what's happening in the world, I am beginning to see what's happening in the world in the light of this spiritual classic by St. John of the Cross, The Dark Night. And we know that the dark night is not just a personal kind of experience, especially some of the liberation theologians from Latin America in the 80s talked about how the dark night can also be an experience of our species, an experience that our systems are going through. And it seems to me that this is what is happening. And so then if my assessment is correct, then what kind of advice can we get from St. John of the Cross as to how to approach this experience when everything is falling apart, when things are disintegrating, and when we feel like we're literally being chopped into pieces? And what he tells us is that when we are having that experience, that is the time to let go of all of the things that in the past helped us to achieve our balance and fix the things that were not working. He basically is telling us that whenever you are faced with that kind of experience, this is not the time to try to think into some kind of a solution or a way of being. You have to live into a new way of thinking. And so his advice is that when that happens, when you witness the collapse, all you have to do is just essentially be present to it and allow all the pieces to fall. So we have to allow for that to happen in ourselves and in our world. And our job is to really be there in this state of curious not knowing with faith, trusting that underneath it all, there's going to be some kind of a presence that somehow will do some work on us. And through that process that feels like some kind of a surgery without any kind of anesthesia, we will somehow be remade into new kinds of species for those of us who can faithfully go through that process. And so I think that for me, this is what I'm seeing as a problem. Essentially, whether we're talking about, people on the right or people on the left, and I know in the US it's a bit more polarized probably than in the UK. I'm still seeing that basically we are convinced that our strategies and our answers could produce the desired outcome, the desired healing, the desired transformation. And I'm beginning to see more and more that even those proposals that sound very good oftentimes actually come from the same place that created the problems that we are trying to solve. And John of the Cross has this beautiful teaching that is terrifying. He basically says, what happens when you throw a log of wood into the fire? And he says, well, at first, the wood sheds its tears because all the moisture inside of the wood needs to come out. And you smell something that is not very pleasant, and the color changes and it becomes kind of ugly. But then once all of the things that are contrary to the nature of fire, once all of that is released, that log of wood becomes one with fire. And then it can no longer do anything contrary to what is the nature and action of fire. And so to me, this is kind of what I'm sitting with these days, you know? How can I be present to what is happening in the world? How can I stop pretending that I know what the answers are? How can I continuously, on daily basis, confess my powerlessness? How can I confess my irrelevance so God can become relevant in me and hopefully through me somehow? And I think that that in many ways connects to what Justine said, that we move away from this kind of anthropocentric, you know, idea that our minds and our intellects and our brilliance can essentially rethink all of it and recreate all of it. I think something much deeper than that is needed. So that's what I'm sitting with right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. One of our conversations was on embracing chaos, which spoke to a very similar process of what you're talking about there. And a reference that came up quite a lot in that was the process of caterpillar into butterfly and the mush state, which reminded me of what you were talking about with the wood in the fire. And we're actually following up that conversation in a couple of weeks with a conversation on chaos into transformation. So how we can embrace the dismantle, allowing the chaos to move into something new. So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, both of you. Unfortunately, we're going to have to finish, but just before we finish, there's a couple of comments I just wanted to read out from our listeners. One of them is, wow, Justine speaks the truth. I'm so thrilled to have heard her. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And another one is, Adam is Adam is clearly a true holy man. Great to have someone with such spirit. Thank you so much. So yeah, just a couple of comments from our appreciation.
I just wanted to respond to that, you know, thank you for those kind words, but I'm just as broken as, you know, anyone else. And so it's, you know, daily powerlessness.
Yeah, absolutely what you just spoken to. Thanks for mentioning that, because we're real human beings as well, aren't we? So, so thank you. This is the last of our new live conversations, and we're nearing the end of our pilot series of these conversations now. So the next 5 weeks, we're going to be doing part 2 to our most popular conversations so far, which is going to be including work and money, food resilience, dismantling conquest, part 2 of that. We're also going to be doing family and parenting next week. So I think, and there's one more which I can't remember at this moment, but we're following up on the most popular conversations and giving a bit more, and we're also looking at, with the different groups, putting together some resources and more signposting information for people on these topics. So that's what we're going to be doing for the next 5 weeks. So next week is going to be part 2 of family and parenting. And then we're going to have a 4-week break after that, and we'll be launching the project officially on the 6th of July, where we will have a website, and we're also going to be launching a new branch of this project called Community Resilience Advocates, where we've got a lovely dedicated team who are going to be helping people to take what we're talking about and being inspired by it into action in their communities. So that's a whole other thing I will talk more about at some point. So thank you both, yes, so much for being part of this conversation. I feel like we could go for at least another hour, and there's so many more questions I want to ask you, but I'm profoundly impacted by the dialogue and really grateful for everything that you're doing at this time and for sharing your honesty and your humanity. Thank you so much. Wishing you well.
Bless you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm really grateful that we've had this time together.
Thank you. Thanks, Justine.
Thank you. Bless you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Community resilience in changing times.